In the highlands of Ethiopia, a land of rugged mountains and ancient civilizations, the late 19th century witnessed a momentous event that would echo through history, the Battle of Adwa. At a time when much of Africa had been divided among European powers, Ethiopia stood as an anomaly, a proud, independent nation, resolute in its defiance against the encroaching forces of colonialism. The battle was not merely a military confrontation. It was a stand for national sovereignty, for the pride of an entire continent, and for a future that could offer Africa its dignity and freedom in the face of European imperialism. By the 1880s, the scramble for Africa had gained full momentum. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 had set the terms for the partitioning of Africa among European powers, with little regard for the continent's native peoples, cultures, or states. Colonial expansion had swept across the continent, from the Nile to the Congo, from the Gold Coast to the Cape Colony. Ethiopia, however, had remained largely untouched. It was one of the few African nations that had successfully resisted European conquest, and this fact made it a target for imperial powers looking to solidify their control over East Africa. At the heart of this struggle stood Menelik II, the Emperor of Ethiopia, whose vision for his people was one of independence and modernization. Menelik was not just a warrior king. He was also a shrewd diplomat who understood the geopolitics of his time. Having ascended to the throne in 1889, Menelik was faced with the challenge of maintaining his nation's sovereignty while balancing the growing influence of European powers, particularly Italy. Italy, which had already established colonies in the region, sought to expand its holdings and bring Ethiopia under its control. In 1889, the Treaty of Wachel was signed between Italy and Ethiopia. On the surface, the treaty was meant to formalize Ethiopia's relationship with Italy, but beneath the surface, it was a cunning move by Italy to assert its dominance. The treaty contained an ambiguous clause that would allow Italy to claim a protectorate over Ethiopia. Menelik, cautious of Italy's true intentions, initially agreed to the terms, believing that the treaty would preserve Ethiopia's independence. However, upon reviewing the treaty, it became clear that the Italian translation of the document differed significantly from the Amharic version signed by Menelik. The Italian version implied that Ethiopia had effectively become a vassal state under Italian protection, stripping the country of its sovereignty. Menelik, realizing the gravity of the situation, rejected the treaty and demanded its annulment. This rejection marked the beginning of a confrontation that would culminate in the Battle of Adwa. As tensions rose, Italy began to mobilize its forces, preparing for war in order to impose its will on the Ethiopian Empire. Menelik, however, was not one to back down. His resolve was bolstered by a deep sense of national pride and a desire to protect the heritage and freedom of his people. The emperor began to prepare Ethiopia for the inevitable conflict. Ethiopia's military readiness, however, was not based on sheer numbers or modern weaponry alone. The Ethiopian people had a long history of military tradition, and Menelik drew upon this heritage to rally his forces. He sought to unite the various ethnic groups within Ethiopia, recognizing that the survival of the nation depended on the unity of its diverse peoples. His efforts to modernize Ethiopia's military were also significant. Menelik imported modern weapons, including rifles and artillery, and he established a more organized, professional army. This would prove crucial in the battle to come. In contrast, Italy's military was ill-prepared for a campaign in the Ethiopian highlands. The Italian forces, though technologically superior in terms of weapons and training, were not accustomed to the harsh terrain and the formidable Ethiopian resistance. Moreover, the Italian command was divided and uncertain about how to approach the situation. There was no cohesive strategy, and the Italian forces, underestimating the strength and resolve of the Ethiopian people, were ill-prepared for the scale of the confrontation. The Italian invasion began in earnest in 1895, when an army of roughly 17,000 Italian troops, supported by local mercenaries and Eritrean auxiliaries, advanced into Ethiopia. They were met by the Ethiopian forces, which numbered around 100,000, though the numbers are often debated. Despite being outnumbered and having inferior weaponry, the Italians had the advantage of modern artillery and rifles. Yet, Menelik's forces were well-trained, deeply motivated, and fiercely committed to the defense of their homeland. The Italians' advance was slow and marked by logistical difficulties. Ethiopia's geography, with its rugged mountains, dense forests, and rivers, was a formidable challenge for the invaders. As the Italians pressed forward, they encountered resistance at every turn. Menelik's strategy was to engage in guerrilla tactics, ambushing Italian supply lines and cutting off reinforcements. The Ethiopian army was adept at navigating the harsh terrain, while the Italians struggled to maintain their supply chains and keep their forces in fighting shape. By early 1896, the Italian forces had reached the town of Adwa, a strategic location in the Tigray region. Menelik, however, had already mobilized his army, gathering forces from across the country to confront the invaders. His army was not only motivated by the desire to defend their homeland, but also by a growing sense of unity and pride. The Ethiopians were fighting not just for their emperor, but for their very identity and independence. The battle that would unfold near Adwa was not simply a military engagement. It was a battle for the future of Ethiopia, and by extension, for the future of Africa. On March 1st, 1896, the two armies met in a decisive confrontation. The Battle of Adwa unfolded as a clash of civilizations, with the Ethiopians defending their ancient sovereignty against the might of a European empire. The battle itself was a resounding victory for Ethiopia. The Italian forces, caught off guard by the strength and determination of their opponents, were decisively defeated. The Italian command was scattered, and many Italian soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. The victory at Adwa was a momentous event, not just for Ethiopia, but for the entire African continent. For the Ethiopians, the victory was a symbol of their resilience and their refusal to submit to foreign domination. It was a triumph of national pride and unity, and it sent a powerful message to the European powers that Africa was not a passive victim of colonialism. The Battle of Adwa marked the first time in the modern era that an African nation had successfully repelled a European colonial power, and it inspired anti-colonial movements across the continent. For Italy, the defeat at Adwa was a humiliation that would reverberate for years to come. It shattered Italy's ambitions in East Africa and undermined the country's standing on the global stage. The loss exposed the limits of European power in Africa and made it clear that the colonial project was not an inevitable march to domination. The aftermath of the battle left Ethiopia with not only its sovereignty intact, but also with newfound respect and recognition on the world stage. Menelik II's victory at Adwa elevated him to the status of a hero, not just in Ethiopia, but across Africa. The battle was a turning point in the history of the continent, symbolizing the possibility of resistance and the importance of unity in the face of colonialism. Yet, while Adwa was a moment of triumph, it was also the beginning of a new phase in Ethiopia's struggle. The victory did not guarantee lasting peace. The battle itself had taken a heavy toll on the Ethiopian people, and the specter of European intervention remained ever present. But the victory at Adwa provided the foundation for Ethiopia's enduring independence, and it became a symbol of Africa's potential to resist colonization. The day Ethiopia stood unconquered would forever resonate in the hearts of Africans, a beacon of hope in an era of darkness. The year following the Battle of Adwa was a defining moment in Ethiopia's history, one that would not only shape the trajectory of Menelik II's reign, but also set the stage for the broader dynamics of African resistance to colonialism. The victory at Adwa had sent shockwaves through the imperial powers of Europe, affirming Ethiopia's independence and establishing it as a beacon of resistance against the wave of colonization sweeping across the continent. Yet, while the battlefield was a decisive victory, the aftermath of Adwa was fraught with both opportunity and complexity for Ethiopia. It was a moment that demanded the full attention of Menelik II, who had successfully secured his country's sovereignty, but now faced the daunting task of maintaining and consolidating that independence in a world increasingly dominated by colonial powers. Menelik's victory at Adwa was not simply a military triumph. It was a strategic and diplomatic victory that had profound implications. The Italian defeat shattered Italy's ambitions in East Africa, but did not eliminate the European desire to carve up Africa. Ethiopia's victory, therefore, was a moment of exhilaration but also a challenge, as the emperor now had to navigate the complex and treacherous waters of international diplomacy. Europe, still determined to maintain its hold over Africa, could not afford to allow one of its colonies to be defeated so comprehensively. The European powers were aware that Ethiopia's example could serve as an inspiration for other African nations to challenge colonial authority. As such, Ethiopia's independence became a symbol to both the colonized peoples of Africa and to the imperial powers that were beginning to question the viability of their dominion. Menelik was keenly aware of the international pressures bearing down on his country. His diplomacy, after all, had been a crucial element in the success of his military campaign. Understanding the precarious position of Ethiopia, surrounded by European colonies on all sides, Menelik sought to cement his country's sovereignty through a combination of military readiness, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic alliances. The emperor knew that Ethiopia's military victory, while decisive on the battlefield, would need to be supplemented by a firm, diplomatic stance in order to secure lasting peace and recognition. The treaty that Menelik had rejected in 1893 was only the beginning of his diplomatic efforts. Following the victory at Adwa, Menelik worked diligently to gain international recognition of Ethiopia's independence. The first major test came with the Treaty of Addis Ababa in 1896, signed with Italy, in which Italy was forced to officially recognize Ethiopia's sovereignty. The treaty not only affirmed Ethiopia's victory, but also allowed Italy to retain some semblance of honor by recognizing its role as an intermediary between Ethiopia and the European powers. Though the treaty was a diplomatic victory for Menelik, it also reflected the complicated relationship Ethiopia had with Europe. The treaty acknowledged Ethiopia's independence, but also placed it in a precarious position, as it left open the possibility of further European intervention under the guise of protectorates and trade agreements. Despite this diplomatic success, Ethiopia remained isolated in a world dominated by European imperialism. Its victory at Adwa, while symbolically significant, did not change the fundamental dynamics of global power. Menelik's diplomatic acumen was tested time and again as he sought to ensure Ethiopia's continued survival. The empire's diplomatic ties with Russia, France, and Great Britain became vital in this effort. Menelik sought to maintain neutrality in the broader imperial struggle, recognizing that his country's best chance at survival lay in staying out of the larger European conflict, while also securing military support and favorable trade agreements. The intricate web of alliances and treaties that Menelik wove throughout the late 19th century demonstrated his shrewdness and his understanding of Ethiopia's fragile geopolitical position. Internally, the battle's aftermath also left Menelik with the delicate task of rebuilding his country. While Ethiopia had emerged victorious on the battlefield, the toll of war was undeniable. The battle had taken a heavy toll on both the Ethiopian military and the civilian population. Thousands of lives have been lost in the fighting, and the infrastructure of the northern regions of the country have been severely damaged. In the wake of the battle, Menelik needed to ensure that the wounded soldiers and civilians received the care and resources they needed to recover. His efforts to rebuild the country's infrastructure, such as roads and communication systems, were crucial in maintaining both military readiness and national unity. However, the financial burden of the war left the country's economy in a fragile state. Menelik was also faced with the challenge of managing the diversity of his empire, which was home to a wide array of ethnic groups, languages, and traditions. The challenge of unifying Ethiopia in the aftermath of a victory that was as much cultural as it was military was a task that required patience and skillful governance. While Menelik's military success at Adwa had solidified his place as a national hero, it was not without its challenges. The emperor faced constant opposition from within his court and from other factions of Ethiopian society. The legacy of Adwa was still fresh, and the emperor had to manage the expectations of the people, many of whom had placed their faith in him as the protector of Ethiopia's sovereignty. Some within the royal court saw Menelik's diplomatic approach as overly cautious, and there were murmurs of dissatisfaction over his handling of the aftermath of the battle. The northern provinces, particularly Tigray, where the battle had taken place, were deeply impacted by the conflict. These provinces, having borne the brunt of the fighting, were now in need of rebuilding. Menelik faced the difficult task of managing these demands for reconstruction while maintaining the unity of his diverse empire. Another challenge Menelik faced in the aftermath of Adwa was the presence of European influence in the region. Although Ethiopia had defeated Italy, it was surrounded by European colonies, and European influence in Africa was not easily dispelled. The presence of British-controlled Sudan to the west and French-controlled Djibouti to the east meant that Ethiopia had to tread carefully in its foreign relations. Despite the victory at Adwa, Menelik could not afford to alienate European powers entirely, as Ethiopia was still reliant on European trade and technology. The emperor's delicate balancing act between asserting Ethiopia's independence and managing relations with European powers was a defining feature of his foreign policy in the years following Adwa. Meanwhile, Menelik's victory resonated far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. The success of Ethiopia against the Italian invaders became a symbol for the entire continent, a testament to African resilience in the face of European domination. The victory at Adwa inspired many other African nations, giving hope to colonized peoples who had resigned themselves to the idea that European conquest was inevitable. Ethiopia's resistance proved that the forces of imperialism could be challenged and defeated, and it sparked a wave of anti-colonial movements across the continent. The victory provided proof that colonial powers were not invincible, and it emboldened African leaders and nationalists to continue their fight for independence. However, Ethiopia's continued struggle was far from over. The international recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty, while an important achievement, did not eliminate the risks of European intervention. Even as Menelik consolidated power and rebuilt his country, the geopolitical realities of the late 19th century meant that Ethiopia remained in a constant state of vigilance. The emperor's diplomatic maneuvering, his efforts to strengthen Ethiopia's internal unity, and his vision for the future would all be tested in the years that followed. Adwa was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of Ethiopia's journey as an independent nation in a rapidly changing world. The years following the Battle of Adwa marked a critical period of consolidation for Ethiopia. Menelik II had achieved the unthinkable, a resounding victory against a European colonial power. The battle had demonstrated that Ethiopian military prowess, bolstered by national unity and resolve, was capable of defending the country's independence. However, the aftermath of Adwa presented challenges that were both internal and external, calling for a delicate balance of diplomacy, military preparedness, and governance. While the victory over Italy in 1896 had secured Ethiopia's sovereignty in the short term, it did not eliminate the broader pressures of European colonial ambitions. The scramble for Africa, though momentarily stalled by Ethiopia's victory, was far from over. The European powers remained keen on expanding their territories, and Ethiopia's resistance at Adwa had made the empire a symbol of defiance. But as much as the victory had been a triumph for Ethiopia, it also placed Menelik in the challenging position of safeguarding that hard-won independence. The emperor was acutely aware that the battle at Adwa had not sealed the future of Ethiopia forever. Rather, it had bought the country time to solidify its borders, time to modernize its institutions, and time to strengthen its alliances. Menelik's first priority was the stability of Ethiopia itself. His empire, though victorious, was diverse, fragmented, and financially strained. The northern provinces, which had been the site of intense fighting, required significant reconstruction. The economic cost of the war was immense, and the resources needed for rebuilding the damaged infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and communication lines, were in short supply. Menelik's ability to govern an empire that stretched from the Red Sea to the highlands of the Ethiopian plateau required more than military might. It demanded effective administration, diplomatic skill, and the ability to manage the country's diverse ethnic groups. The emperor's internal reforms were pivotal in this process. Ethiopia, as an ancient civilization, was not lacking in a rich cultural history, but in terms of governance, it faced significant challenges. Menelik understood that in order to survive in a modern world increasingly dominated by European powers, Ethiopia would need to adapt. One of his greatest achievements during this period was his attempt to modernize Ethiopia's infrastructure. He sought to establish a functioning system of roads and railways to connect Ethiopia's disparate regions. This was essential not just for trade and communication, but for national defense. In a country where its geography played a crucial role in its resistance to foreign invasion, Menelik saw the importance of improving connectivity for both economic and military purposes. One of the significant hurdles Menelik faced in this effort was the lack of a centralized, efficient bureaucracy. The country's administrative structure was rooted in ancient feudal systems, where local lords wielded considerable power over their territories. In order to create a more unified and cohesive state, Menelik sought to reduce the power of regional aristocrats and establish a centralized system of governance. He also sought to bring the church into the fold of modern governance. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had always played a central role in the country's affairs, but Menelik understood that the church's influence needed to be balanced with the need for a modern, secular state. The emperor's efforts to bring about administrative reform were met with some resistance from the traditional aristocracy, but his strong leadership and diplomatic skills allowed him to navigate these challenges. Another key challenge facing Menelik during this period was the need to bolster Ethiopia's military. While the victory at Adwa had proved the military capabilities of the Ethiopian army, Menelik knew that in a rapidly changing world, military power was not only about numbers, but also about technology and training. The emperor had long been aware of the need for modernization, and in the years after the battle, he focused on furthering his efforts to equip Ethiopia with modern weaponry. He imported rifles and artillery from European sources, knowing that Ethiopia's survival would depend on its ability to defend itself in the face of European aggression. However, modernizing Ethiopia's military was not without its difficulties. The country's relative isolation from global trade networks made it difficult to secure the necessary weapons and materials. Despite this, Menelik was able to maintain a steady flow of modern weapons, largely thanks to his diplomatic relations with European powers such as France, Russia, and Great Britain. His diplomatic maneuvering allowed Ethiopia to secure weapons and military expertise, which were crucial in maintaining the country's defense capabilities. Externally, Menelik continued to navigate the delicate diplomacy that was necessary to ensure Ethiopia's security. In the years following Adwa, the emperor worked tirelessly to maintain Ethiopia's independence through diplomatic channels. He understood that his country's survival depended on the ability to manage relationships with the colonial power surrounding him. Menelik had the foresight to see that a policy of neutrality would not be enough to guarantee Ethiopia's safety in an increasingly imperialistic world. Therefore, he pursued alliances with European powers that were not directly involved in the partitioning of Africa. His relationship with Russia was particularly important during this period. In 1897, Menelik welcomed the Russian military mission to Ethiopia, which sent advisors to help train the Ethiopian army. Russia, at that time, was eager to gain influence in Africa and saw Ethiopia as a potential ally in the fight against British and French colonial ambitions. The Russian mission provided Ethiopia with valuable military knowledge and helped further modernize the country's armed forces. This alliance, though primarily military, also served as a diplomatic counterbalance to the growing influence of Italy, Britain, and France in the region. Ethiopia's relationship with Britain was also vital, as Britain controlled the neighboring Sudan and had significant interests in the Red Sea region. Menelik maintained a delicate balance with the British, managing to keep them at bay while also securing trade agreements that benefited Ethiopia. Though the British were wary of Ethiopia's independence, they recognized that the country could be a valuable trading partner in the Horn of Africa. Menelik was able to use his diplomatic relations with Britain to his advantage, ensuring that Ethiopia's sovereignty was respected. The emperor's relationship with France was another critical factor in his diplomacy. France, which had colonial interests in the region, was eager to prevent Italy from gaining a foothold in Ethiopia. Menelik played on this rivalry, offering France favorable trade terms in exchange for military support. In return, France provided Ethiopia with additional weaponry and diplomatic backing. Menelik's ability to exploit the competing interests of the European powers surrounding Ethiopia was a testament to his diplomatic acumen and his understanding of the delicate balance of power. However, despite his diplomatic success, Menelik's rule was not without controversy. In the years following Adwa, he faced increasing opposition from within his own court and from other factions of Ethiopian society. His centralization efforts had alienated many of the traditional nobility, who saw their power eroded by the emperor's reforms. The northern provinces, particularly Tigray, where the Battle of Adwa had taken place, were still recovering from the devastation of war, and there were tensions over Menelik's handling of the reconstruction process. Additionally, Menelik's health began to deteriorate, which added further complexity to his rule. By the late 1890s, the emperor's health had become a matter of concern, and this raised questions about the future leadership of Ethiopia. Menelik had no clear heir to the throne, and as his health worsened, rumors of succession disputes began to circulate. These internal struggles, combined with external pressures, created a volatile political environment. Despite these challenges, Menelik's reign was a defining period in Ethiopia's history. His victory at Adwa had solidified Ethiopia's place as one of the few African nations to successfully resist European colonization, and his diplomatic and military strategies had preserved the country's sovereignty. However, as Menelik's health continued to decline, Ethiopia's future hung in the balance. The challenges of governance, diplomacy, and military modernization would continue to define the empire's trajectory. The next phase of Ethiopia's struggle would not be on the battlefield, but within the very heart of the empire itself. As the years passed after the triumph at Adwa, Menelik II's reign began to show the wear and tear of both external and internal pressures. Despite the monumental victory and the continued preservation of Ethiopian sovereignty, the challenges that lay ahead were multifaceted, complex, and often exacerbated by the emperor's declining health. The foundation for Ethiopia's survival had been laid, but sustaining it required navigating through a delicate balance of governance, diplomacy, and the restoration of national unity. The period following the Battle of Adwa marked a crucial juncture in Ethiopian history, one where the echoes of past victories seemed to grow fainter against the backdrop of internal divisions, external threats, and the looming question of succession. Menelik, by all accounts, had been a visionary leader whose leadership not only secured Ethiopia's independence, but also established it as a beacon of resistance against colonialism. Yet, as the emperor's health began to falter in the late 1890s, his ability to lead was increasingly called into question. The question of succession had long been an issue within the Ethiopian court, and with Menelik's deteriorating health, this uncertainty became even more pronounced. His only surviving son, Ieyasu, had been groomed as the heir to the throne, but there were doubts about his readiness to lead. Ieyasu was young, inexperienced, and, more importantly, seen by some as lacking the political acumen that had characterized his father's reign. The emperor's illness, coupled with the uncertainty surrounding the succession, created an unstable political climate that threatened to undo the work Menelik had fought so hard to establish. One of the first signs of this instability emerged in 1898 when Menelik suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated. While his physical condition deteriorated, the emperor's mind remained sharp, but he was no longer able to perform the duties of the head of state. This incapacitation led to a temporary power vacuum, as the question of who would assume the throne became a matter of urgency. His wife, Empress Tetu, and the high-ranking officials of the court began to jockey for power, each hoping to secure their own position in the event of Menelik's death. This power struggle not only weakened the central authority of the emperor, but also sowed the seeds of division within the Ethiopian aristocracy. Menelik's absence from the throne also invited foreign powers to test the strength of Ethiopia's position. Though Italy had been humiliated at Adwa, it still sought to find a way to reassert its influence in the Horn of Africa. The unstable political climate within Ethiopia, combined with the weakening of Menelik's rule, made the country vulnerable to further European intervention. In the midst of this uncertainty, the Regency Council, led by Ras Betwadad, took over the administration of the country. Although the council was intended to stabilize the situation, it only served to deepen the divisions within the Ethiopian court. Ras Betwadad, an ambitious and powerful noble, was determined to keep power within the hands of the aristocracy. He was unwilling to support Menelik's young heir, Iyasu, fearing that the prince would not be able to hold the empire together. Betwadad and his faction thus pursued a more conservative and traditional path, seeking to preserve the influence of the nobility and limit the power of the monarchy. This caused a rift within the court, with those loyal to Menelik's vision for a modernized, centralized Ethiopia clashing with those who saw the emperor's reforms as a threat to their own power. In this period of political turmoil, the foreign powers surrounding Ethiopia began to take advantage of the instability. Italy, still reeling from its defeat at Adwa, sought to regain its footing in East Africa by forming new alliances and exploiting the power vacuum within Ethiopia. Italian diplomats quietly worked to expand their influence in the region, particularly in Eritrea, which had been under Italian control since the 1880s. Despite the humiliation of their military defeat at Adwa, Italy continued to push for economic and political concessions from Ethiopia. This diplomatic pressure was made more potent by the fact that the British, French, and Russians were also vying for influence in the region, making Ethiopia a prize to be contested by multiple European powers. Menelik's reign had not only been about securing Ethiopia's independence from European colonizers, but also about navigating the delicate web of relationships between the European powers. His ability to maintain Ethiopia's autonomy depended on his diplomatic expertise and his ability to keep the imperial powers at bay. But as the emperor's health declined, the balance of power began to shift. Italy's attempts to reassert its influence through diplomacy gained traction, and Ethiopia's once solid relationships with countries like Russia began to weaken. Menelik had successfully navigated the geopolitical landscape during his reign, but his absence from the political stage left a vacuum that others were eager to fill. Meanwhile, within Ethiopia, the question of modernity versus tradition continued to divide the court and the military elite. Menelik had made great strides in modernizing Ethiopia, importing new weaponry and technology, and creating a more centralized system of governance. However, many of the nobility saw these changes as a threat to their traditional ways of life. The nobility, who had once been powerful landowners and military leaders, found themselves losing influence as Menelik built a more centralized, bureaucratic state. The increasing focus on modernizing the military, creating infrastructure, and establishing a more professional state apparatus was seen by some as a betrayal of Ethiopia's traditional ways. The divide between the modernizers and the traditionalists grew wider as Menelik's health worsened. This divide was particularly evident in the growing tension between those who sought to strengthen the monarchy and those who believed that the power of the nobility should be preserved. The court became a battleground for control, and the resulting instability undermined Menelik's legacy. Ras Betwadad, who represented the traditionalist faction, grew increasingly influential, and his resistance to the changes Menelik had introduced threatened to undo the progress the emperor had made. The situation reached a boiling point in 1900 when Menelik, although still alive, was effectively sidelined. His health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer govern, and the Regency Council took full control of the country. Iyasu, despite being the rightful heir to the throne, was seen by many as too inexperienced and weak to lead. The battle for succession between the Regency and Iyasu's supporters became increasingly bitter, with the emperor's weakened state exacerbating the conflict. The result was an even further fragmentation of power within Ethiopia, with regional lords and factions asserting their autonomy. Amidst this political turmoil, Menelik's legacy began to feel increasingly fragile. While his victories had ensured Ethiopia's independence and his modernizing efforts had begun to shape the future of the country, his inability to secure a stable political transition and prevent the internal rifts from escalating would leave Ethiopia vulnerable to future challenges. In many ways, Menelik's reign ended not with a dramatic military defeat or the collapse of Ethiopia's sovereignty, but with a slow unraveling of unity, both within the royal court and within the broader Ethiopian society. Despite the internal conflict and the weakening of Menelik's rule, the memory of Adwa remained a powerful symbol of Ethiopia's resistance to foreign domination. The Battle of Adwa continued to inspire generations of Ethiopians, and the memory of the emperor's triumph over Italy became a rallying cry for national unity. Yet, the political instability following Adwa highlighted a deeper issue: the need for a sustainable political system that could withstand both internal divisions and external pressures. Ethiopia's survival depended not only on military victories, but on the ability to reconcile modernity and tradition, unity and diversity, in a way that would preserve the nation's independence in an increasingly hostile world. In the final years of Menelik's reign, the emperor's vision for Ethiopia, one a modernized, unified, and independent state, seemed more fragile than ever. The battle for control of the throne, the destabilizing effects of factionalism, and the growing influence of foreign powers all contributed to a period of uncertainty and decline. Menelik had built the foundations of a great empire, but the internal divisions that followed his stroke would undermine his efforts and create a legacy that was both heroic and tragic. The future of Ethiopia remained uncertain, and the shadow of Menelik's decline loomed over the empire, even as the ideals of the victory at Adwa continued to inspire those who sought to defend Ethiopia's sovereignty. As the new century dawned on Ethiopia, the lingering effects of the Battle of Adwa and Menelik II's health deterioration cast a long shadow over the empire. The victory against Italy in 1896 had made Ethiopia a symbol of resistance to colonialism, and Menelik II's leadership had solidified the country's independence in a world rapidly succumbing to the forces of European imperialism. Yet, as the political instability set in, following the emperor's incapacitation, Ethiopia's future became uncertain. The underlying fractures that had been present in the Ethiopian aristocracy and among the various ethnic and regional groups began to widen, signaling that the unity achieved under Menelik's reign might not endure in his absence. The quest for power, the battle over succession, and the growing influence of foreign powers would become defining elements in the period that followed the emperor's decline. Menelik's reign had always been a tightrope walk between modernizing his country and respecting the deeply entrenched traditions of the Ethiopian nobility. The emperor had understood that Ethiopia's survival depended on navigating both internal dynamics and the external pressures that came from an imperialist world. His ability to keep Ethiopia intact, both politically and militarily, had been rooted in his remarkable diplomatic skill and his strategic management of alliances with foreign powers. Menelik had cultivated relationships with Russia, France, and Britain, playing them off against each other while ensuring Ethiopia's sovereignty. His success at Adwa had shown that a well-coordinated military and diplomatic strategy could protect his country from the clutches of colonization. However, as his health failed and the succession question became central, Menelik's internal political landscape grew more fragmented, and the unity that had held Ethiopia together seemed increasingly fragile. Following Menelik's incapacitation in 1898, his wife, Empress Tetu, initially played a significant role in the interim leadership of the country. However, the Ethiopian court, particularly the high-ranking military officials and aristocrats, had their own ideas about how the empire should be governed. The power struggle within the court quickly became evident as various factions emerged, each vying for control over Ethiopia's future. While Empress Tetu attempted to hold on to power, she lacked the military support that Menelik had once commanded. Moreover, the shifting alliances between regional lords and the court's internal divisions led to an environment of instability, further exacerbated by the uncertain future of the throne. At the heart of this struggle was the question of succession. Menelik's son, Iyasu, had been named as his heir, but the young prince was not universally accepted. Iyasu, though the legitimate successor, was viewed by many as unfit to rule, primarily due to his youth and perceived lack of experience. While Menelik had ensured his son was well-educated and prepared to inherit the throne, Iyasu's personality and political outlook were seen as out of step with the realities of Ethiopia's delicate political situation. Iyasu was more idealistic than pragmatic, and his youthful enthusiasm for reform and change alienated many of the conservative factions within the court. The aristocracy, which had enjoyed a significant amount of power under Menelik's reign, was not eager to see their privileges diminished under a ruler who might challenge the status quo. In the absence of strong leadership from Iyasu, the Regency Council, which had been established to govern in the emperor's stead, sought to consolidate its control. The council, initially a temporary measure to guide the empire during Menelik's illness, became an entrenched political body that sought to shape Ethiopia's future according to its own vision. Ras Betwadad, one of the most influential figures in the Regency, represented the traditionalist faction that sought to preserve the power of the nobility and maintain the feudal structure that had defined Ethiopian politics for centuries. This faction was opposed to any significant reforms, fearing that changes would erode their control over local and regional affairs. They viewed Menelik's attempts at centralization and modernization with suspicion, and in the post-Adwa era, they were unwilling to allow further encroachment on their autonomy. The Empress Tetu, who had wielded considerable influence as Menelik's consort, was caught in the middle of this power struggle. Her position was precarious as her support base began to erode. Although she had initially assumed a prominent role in governance, her inability to effectively manage the growing factionalism in the court contributed to her eventual downfall. In 1913, Tetu was forced to relinquish her position as the de facto ruler, and the Regency Council's influence grew even stronger. This shift of power created a more unstable political environment, and the Ethiopian court became increasingly divided over how best to manage the empire's future. Iyasu, struggling to assert his authority and win the loyalty of the powerful regional lords and aristocrats, found himself increasingly isolated. His youth, coupled with his controversial stance on religious and political reforms, made it difficult for him to gain the necessary support to consolidate power. Iyasu was eager to push for modernization, advocating for greater equality between ethnic groups and stronger ties with European powers. However, his reforms alienated the traditional power structures within Ethiopia, especially the conservative religious factions and the military elite. His reforms were seen as too radical and were often dismissed by those who had benefited from the existing system of patronage and privilege. Furthermore, Iyasu's perceived closeness with Muslim communities at a time when Ethiopia was a staunchly Christian empire aroused suspicions among the Orthodox Christian elite, further dividing the country along religious lines. While Iyasu struggled to establish his authority in Ethiopia, the situation on the international stage was shifting as well. Italy, having suffered defeat at Adwa, had not abandoned its ambitions in East Africa. The Italians continued to press their interests in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Eritrea, which they had colonized after the defeat. The shifting dynamics in Ethiopia, characterized by internal power struggles and a lack of clear leadership, provided Italy with an opportunity to reassert its influence in the region. The instability within Ethiopia's court allowed European powers to test the country's resolve, and diplomatic maneuvering became even more critical as the empire's leadership faltered. Ethiopia's relations with Italy were particularly tense. Despite Italy's defeat at Adwa, the Italian government saw an opportunity to regain its lost prestige by exploiting the internal divisions within Ethiopia. In the early 1900s, Italy attempted to negotiate new treaties with Ethiopia, seeking to limit its sovereignty and expand its influence over Ethiopian affairs. The Italians were keen to establish a foothold in Ethiopia, but the Ethiopian court, particularly the traditionalists, remained wary of Italian intentions. Despite their military defeat, Italy had not given up on its ambitions to establish a protectorate over Ethiopia, and the Italian diplomatic corps continued to push for an agreement that would solidify Italian control over key regions. In addition to Italian pressure, Ethiopia also had to contend with the growing influence of other European powers, such as France and Britain, which had their own colonial interests in the Horn of Africa. The political instability in Ethiopia created an opportunity for these powers to exploit Ethiopia's vulnerability, with both the British and French seeking to expand their influence over Ethiopian trade and territorial boundaries. The French had already established a foothold in Djibouti, while the British controlled Sudan. Ethiopia's location, straddling important trade routes between the Red Sea and the interior of Africa, made it a strategic prize that European powers were eager to control. Ethiopia's internal struggles, combined with external pressures from European powers, placed the country at a crossroads. While the vision of Menelik II and his success at Adwa had inspired a sense of unity and national pride, the inability of the post-Menelik leadership to navigate these challenges contributed to Ethiopia's growing instability. The factionalism within the Ethiopian court, the failure to modernize effectively, and the increasing influence of foreign powers would all play a role in shaping the trajectory of Ethiopia in the coming decades. Iesu's reign, although marked by some reforms, would ultimately be undermined by these internal divisions and external pressures. The emperor's inability to gain widespread support and the growing discontent within the military and aristocracy set the stage for further instability. In the early 1910s, with Ethiopia's sovereignty once again threatened by foreign powers and by its internal divisions, the path forward for the country remained uncertain. Menelik's legacy, though powerful and inspirational, seemed to fade as Ethiopia struggled to find a stable leadership capable of preserving the independence he had fought so hard to secure. The victory at Adwa, which had seemed like a definitive statement of African resilience, now appeared increasingly fragile as the empire teetered on the brink of yet another political crisis. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it new challenges for Ethiopia, challenges that the nation would struggle to overcome as it dealt with both internal fractures and the external pressures of an increasingly colonial world. The power vacuum left by Menelik II's incapacitation had not only shaken the Ethiopian court, but also undermined the very foundation of the empire's unity. His health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer provide the strong leadership that had been instrumental in securing Ethiopia's sovereignty. The political environment became increasingly unstable, and the succession question, once a matter of ceremonial importance, was now at the center of a fierce battle for control. Menelik's son, Iesu, despite his legitimacy, was viewed with skepticism by many of the ruling elites, who were concerned that his idealistic vision for the future of Ethiopia was at odds with the nation's traditional structures of power. As the tension within the court escalated, the future of Ethiopia seemed increasingly uncertain. The emperor's son, Iesu, faced enormous challenges in his bid to claim the throne. Although the young prince had been educated to lead and had shown promise as a reformer, he struggled to win the loyalty of the nobility, the military, and the religious elite. His attempts to modernize Ethiopia were seen by many as threatening to the status quo that had existed for centuries. The emperor's vision of a more centralized and modernized Ethiopia had already alienated many powerful figures, and Iesu's proposed reforms did little to convince those factions that he would be able to maintain the empire's unity. One of Iesu's most controversial stances was his growing interest in Islamic communities within Ethiopia, an approach that was viewed with great suspicion by the dominant Orthodox Christian elite. At the time, Ethiopia was a deeply religious and conservative country, with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church playing a central role in both political and social life. The church's influence over the people was immense, and any attempt to align with or even show favor to Muslim populations was seen as politically dangerous. Iesu's emphasis on creating a more inclusive society, one that recognized the rights of Muslim Ethiopians, was viewed by many as a betrayal of the Christian heritage that had defined the empire for centuries. But beyond religious divisions, Iesu's efforts to modernize Ethiopia were also deeply at odds with the interests of the feudal lords, who wielded immense power in the regions. These lords had benefited greatly from the traditional system, where land ownership and political power were inextricably linked. Iyasu's centralization efforts, his push to reduce the power of the nobility, and his ambition to modernize the military and the infrastructure of the country were seen as a direct threat to the status quo. The nobility, fearing the loss of their power and privileges, began to conspire against the young emperor, and the divide between the modernizing faction and the traditionalists grew ever more pronounced. The tension between Iyasu and the nobility came to a head in 1913 when the regency, led by Empress Tedu and Ras Betwadad, became more assertive in asserting control over the country. Ras Betwadad, representing the conservative elements of the court, sought to curtail Iyasu's influence. He argued that the prince's youth and lack of experience would lead Ethiopia into chaos, and he was increasingly vocal about his belief that the country needed a more traditional ruler who could ensure the stability of the empire. While the regency held significant power, it was clear that Ethiopia was on the brink of a major political crisis. As the political crisis deepened, the external threats to Ethiopia's sovereignty did not abate. Italy, having suffered a humiliating defeat at Adwa, was eager to regain its lost prestige and expand its influence in the Horn of Africa. Although Italy had been forced to acknowledge Ethiopia's sovereignty in the Treaty of Addis Ababa, its ambitions were far from extinguished. Italy's continued expansion in Eritrea, its growing influence in the Red Sea, and its attempts to secure economic and military ties with the Ethiopian court created an environment where external pressures were mounting once again. Italy saw an opportunity to exploit the instability within the Ethiopian court and to reassert its dominance over the region. Meanwhile, Britain and France, both of whom had colonial interests in East Africa, kept a watchful eye on Ethiopia. Though Ethiopia had been successful in maintaining its sovereignty, it was not immune to the colonial ambitions of European powers. The British, controlling Sudan to the west and with a strategic interest in the Red Sea, had long viewed Ethiopia as a potential ally, but the instability in the Ethiopian court made it difficult for the British to know whom to approach. The French, too, with their colonial holdings in Djibouti, were interested in ensuring that Ethiopia remained neutral in their competition with the British and Italians for control of the region. In this environment, where Ethiopia's political instability and external pressures were mounting, the emperor's health remained a critical issue. Menelik II, despite his deteriorating health, was still revered as the symbol of Ethiopia's strength and independence. However, as his incapacity became more apparent, his once strong leadership began to fade into history. Iyasu's attempts to assert his authority were stymied by the fact that he lacked the ability to unite the various factions of the court. His inability to manage the intricate web of alliances and rivalries left him isolated and unable to control the direction of Ethiopia's future. As the power struggle continued to unfold, the Ethiopian court became a battleground for the future of the empire. The political factions within the court were not merely divided along ideological lines, traditionalism versus modernity, but also along regional, ethnic, and religious lines. The power of the provincial lords, who controlled vast amounts of land and had their own military forces, was a significant factor in the ongoing struggle for control. The court's divisions were mirrored in the military, where different regions held sway and loyalties were divided. These regional differences were critical in shaping the course of the political conflict, as various factions sought to rally military support for their respective causes. The years following Menelik's decline saw Ethiopia descending into a political quagmire. The regency, led by Ras Betwadad and other influential figures, sought to undermine Iyasu's authority, while the young emperor struggled to gain the support of the military and the aristocracy. His calls for reform, his interest in integrating Ethiopia's diverse religious and ethnic communities, and his efforts to modernize the state were drowned out by the voices of those who favored the preservation of the old order. The struggle for power at the court became more pronounced, and Ethiopia's political future appeared uncertain. Externally, the looming threat of foreign intervention hung over the empire. Italy, frustrated by its inability to defeat Ethiopia in the battle for control of East Africa, had turned its attention back to Ethiopia. The country's internal divisions, coupled with the weakening of its central authority, presented an opportunity for Italy to push for a greater presence in the region. The Italian government began to apply pressure on Ethiopia, attempting to forge treaties and agreements that would limit Ethiopia's sovereignty in exchange for economic benefits. Italy also sought to build stronger alliances with Ethiopia's neighbors, hoping to isolate the country diplomatically. The British and French, while more cautious than the Italians, continued to watch Ethiopia closely. The precarious political situation, combined with the growing influence of European powers in the region, made Ethiopia a focal point for competition among the colonial powers. In this environment, the question of Ethiopia's future was increasingly tied to the ability of the ruling factions to navigate the shifting tides of international politics. The internal struggles, coupled with the external pressures, created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The optimism that had followed the victory at Adwa seemed distant as the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The once unified Ethiopian nation, forged by Menelik's strong leadership, was now a fragmented and divided entity, its future hanging in the balance. As the political and military struggle continued, it became clear that Ethiopia's ability to maintain its sovereignty depended on the ability of its leaders to bridge the divides that had formed within the court. The forces of tradition and modernity, of regionalism and centralization, were pulling the country in different directions. The question that loomed largest over Ethiopia was not just whether it could maintain its independence, but whether it could survive as a unified nation in the face of internal division and external threat. The legacy of Menelik II, the hero of Adwa, seemed increasingly vulnerable as Ethiopia faced the prospect of another battle, this time not on the battlefield, but within the corridors of power. The struggle for succession, the fight for political control, and the growing influence of foreign powers would shape the fate of Ethiopia in the years to come. The years following the decline of Menelik II marked a period of profound instability for Ethiopia. Despite the emperor's monumental victory at Adwa and his strategic leadership in securing Ethiopia's independence, his incapacitation and the power struggles that followed plunged the empire into a political and administrative crisis. The empire, which had once stood unified against colonialism, was now fragmented, with different factions within the court, the military, and the regional aristocracy vying for control. The nation that had fought so fiercely for its sovereignty now found itself teetering on the brink of internal disintegration, threatened not only by its own political divisions, but also by the looming presence of foreign powers eager to exploit its vulnerability. After Menelik's stroke in 1898, his son, Ieyasu, who had been groomed to take the throne, faced a difficult task. Though the young prince was the legitimate heir, his ascent to power was not straightforward. Ieyasu, a reformist at heart, sought to bring Ethiopia into a new era of modernization, focusing on unifying the diverse ethnic, religious, and political groups within the empire. However, his progressive agenda was met with fierce resistance from many quarters. The conservative factions, particularly the aristocracy, saw Ieyasu's reforms as a direct threat to their traditional power and privileges. In addition, his efforts to embrace Muslim communities, who had long been marginalized in the Christian-dominated Ethiopian state, were seen by many as an act of betrayal. Ieyasu's attempts at reform were also undermined by his lack of political experience and the fact that he had not yet won the full trust of the military and regional lords. The Ethiopian court, long a battleground of competing factions, became more divided than ever. The traditionalists, led by figures like Ras Betwadad, were determined to maintain the status quo, resisting any attempts to centralize power and modernize the empire. Ras Betwadad and other powerful lords believed that Ieyasu's reforms would weaken the influence of the aristocracy, and they sought to consolidate their control over their territories. The growing rift between the reformist faction, led by Ieyasu, and the traditionalist forces who feared the erosion of their power, deepened Ethiopia's political crisis. In 1909, the Empress Tetu, who had briefly held power during Menelik's illness, sought to assert her authority once again, further complicating the situation. Tatu, who had been a key supporter of Menelik's vision, had not been entirely comfortable with the direction Iyasu was taking the country. Her return to prominence, although brief, was a reminder of how power within the Ethiopian court was continually shifting. Despite Tatu's initial influence, her position was weakened by the growing opposition to her and her inability to maintain control over the military factions and the increasingly powerful regional lords. As the court struggled with its internal divisions, Ethiopia's external enemies remained a constant threat. Italy, having failed to conquer Ethiopia in 1896, did not abandon its ambitions in the Horn of Africa. The Italians were eager to regain their prestige after their defeat at Adwa, and Ethiopia's internal instability provided the perfect opportunity to make another attempt to reassert their influence. The Italian government, frustrated by their inability to break Ethiopia's sovereignty, began pushing for new diplomatic engagements. Their efforts to influence the Ethiopian court, both directly and indirectly, came at a time when the country's leadership was fractured and weak. Italy's renewed efforts to engage Ethiopia diplomatically were part of a broader strategy to increase its control over the region. Italy had already established a colonial foothold in Eritrea, and its growing interest in the Horn of Africa gave it the incentive to exploit Ethiopia's political turmoil. By the turn of the century, Italy's presence in the region was becoming more entrenched. The Italian diplomats, aware of the growing discontent within the Ethiopian court, began to foster alliances with some of the more conservative factions, offering economic incentives and promises of trade agreements in exchange for greater influence. Despite Ethiopia's military success at Adwa, the Italians understood that a divided Ethiopia would be more susceptible to their diplomatic and economic overtures. The British and the French, too, were watching Ethiopia's internal instability closely. Although Britain and France had a complex history of competition for influence in East Africa, they also recognized the strategic importance of Ethiopia in the broader geopolitical landscape. Both powers were invested in the Red Sea region, with British control over Sudan and French influence in Djibouti. Ethiopia's position between these colonial powers made it a critical prize, and its weakened state left it vulnerable to foreign interference. The British, who had been supportive of Ethiopia's independence at times, were wary of the growing influence of Italy in the region, especially given the Italians' ambitions to control the Horn of Africa. The French, too, kept a watchful eye on the shifting political landscape in Ethiopia, ensuring that the Italians did not gain too much power in the region. The growing influence of foreign powers compounded Ethiopia's internal crisis. The failure of the court to unite behind a single leader allowed foreign diplomats to gain traction, and Ethiopia found itself facing increasing pressure from both within and beyond its borders. The political factions within the country were deeply divided, with regional lords and military leaders aligned with different foreign interests. Some factions looked to Italy for support, while others sought to maintain a neutral stance or align with the British and French. The question of Ethiopia's future was no longer just a matter of internal governance, but had become a struggle for influence in the larger international arena. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Menelik II remained a powerful force within Ethiopia. The victory at Adwa had solidified the nation's identity as an independent and proud country, resistant to foreign domination. The memory of the battle continued to inspire Ethiopians, who saw the defeat of the Italians as a symbol of their nation's resilience and unity. The desire to maintain this hard-won independence remained a central tenet of Ethiopian politics, but the ability of the court to preserve this legacy was in jeopardy. Ethiopia's internal divisions, combined with the growing influence of European powers, created a volatile political situation that could only be resolved through a decisive shift in the balance of power. In the early years of the 20th century, Ethiopia's future appeared increasingly uncertain. The reign of Menelik II, characterized by strong leadership, strategic alliances, and military success, had ended. In its place was a leadership vacuum, exacerbated by the emperor's incapacitation and the struggle for control among competing factions. The growing influence of foreign powers in the region only added to the instability, as European nations sought to exploit Ethiopia's weaknesses. Italy, having been humiliated at Adwa, remained determined to achieve its colonial ambitions in the Horn of Africa. At the same time, Ethiopia's internal divisions, particularly the tensions between reformers and traditionalists, threatened to tear the country apart. The battle for Ethiopia's future was being fought not just on the political and diplomatic front, but in the hearts and minds of its people. While some Ethiopians rallied around the idea of modernization and centralization, others remained fiercely loyal to the traditional feudal system that had defined the country for centuries. The growing rift between these factions had deepened the political crisis, and the country seemed to be heading toward a crossroads. The unresolved question of succession, the tensions between reform and tradition, and the external pressures from European powers all combined to create a volatile situation that would define Ethiopia's future. Despite these challenges, Ethiopia remained a symbol of African resistance to colonialism. The memory of Adwa continued to resonate, and the desire to preserve Ethiopia's independence remained a central rallying cry for the nation's people. However, the political struggles within the court, the factionalism, and the growing influence of foreign powers all threatened to undermine the legacy of Menelik II and the ideals for which he had fought. As Ethiopia navigated the turbulent waters of the early 20th century, its leaders would have to confront not only the challenges posed by internal divisions, but also the external pressures of a colonial world eager to reclaim the prize that had eluded them at Adwa. As Ethiopia entered the second decade of the 20th century, the political instability that followed the decline of Menelik II's reign seemed to reach a crescendo. The country that had once been a beacon of resistance against European colonialism was now at a crossroads, facing both internal fragmentation and mounting external pressures. The imperial court, long a battleground for competing factions, had become even more divided. Regional lords, military leaders, and aristocrats continued to vie for control, each with their own vision of Ethiopia's future. And at the heart of the struggle stood the question of succession, a question that not only had personal implications, but also carried the weight of Ethiopia's sovereignty and identity. The power vacuum created by Menelik's incapacitation left Ethiopia without a strong central figure capable of uniting the nation. His son, Ieyasu, had been groomed to take the throne, but his path to power was far from assured. Although Ieyasu had been educated to lead and had inherited his father's charisma, his vision for Ethiopia was deeply controversial. He sought to modernize the empire and bring it into the 20th century, but his approach was met with fierce resistance from many of the country's traditional elites. At a time when the Ethiopian court was riven by divisions, Ieyasu's attempts to reform the military, the economy, and the political system only deepened the rifts within the country. Central to Ieyasu's vision was the idea of greater inclusivity. He recognized that Ethiopia's diverse ethnic and religious groups, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and various indigenous communities, needed to be integrated into a more unified state. However, this approach was seen by many as too radical. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the bedrock of the empire for centuries, was deeply suspicious of Ieyasu's overtures toward Muslim communities. To many of the nobility, Ieyasu's calls for a more modern, centralized state were a direct threat to the feudal system that had allowed them to maintain their power and wealth. The regional lords, who controlled large swaths of land and had their own military forces, feared the erosion of their autonomy under a centralized government. While Ieyasu struggled to gain the trust of the nobility, the growing divisions within the court became more pronounced. On one side were those who wanted to preserve the old order, a system based on feudalism, patronage, and regional power. These traditionalists, led by figures like Ras Betwadad, were determined to prevent any further centralization of power. They had been the beneficiaries of Menelik's system of rule, and they saw any move toward reform as a threat to their privileged position. They also viewed Ieyasu's support for Muslim communities as a direct challenge to the Christian identity of Ethiopia, which had long been a source of national pride. On the other side were the reformers, led by Ieyasu, who believed that the future of Ethiopia lay in modernization. Iyasu's vision of a unified, centralized state, one that embraced progress and technological advancements, stood in stark contrast to the entrenched interests of the aristocracy. His efforts to modernize the military, build infrastructure, and foster economic growth were all part of his strategy to create a stronger, more cohesive Ethiopia. However, these reforms were perceived by many as undermining the traditional power structures that had kept Ethiopia stable for centuries. The reformers, though well-intentioned, were unable to convince the nobility and military leaders that their vision was in the best interest of the country. The struggle for power within the court escalated as the political factions turned against one another. The regency, initially set up to govern in Menelik's absence, became increasingly dominant. Empress Tetu, who had briefly assumed control after Menelik's incapacitation, had lost much of her influence by this time. She had never fully embraced Iyasu's vision, and her brief tenure had been marked by her inability to forge the alliances needed to maintain her authority. Ras Betwadad, a powerful figure within the regency, sought to consolidate his own power and protect the interests of the nobility. His growing influence within the regency further marginalized Iyasu, who found himself increasingly isolated. At the same time, the military, which had been instrumental in Ethiopia's resistance against Italy at Adwa, became a key player in the struggle for power. The Ethiopian army, which had once been a symbol of national unity, was now deeply divided. Some military leaders supported Iyasu's reforms, seeing them as essential for modernizing the country and ensuring its future independence. However, many of the senior officers, particularly those with ties to the nobility, resisted these reforms. They feared that the centralization of power would diminish their own influence and authority. The result was a fractured military that was no longer able to function as a cohesive force for national unity. As the internal conflict deepened, Ethiopia's external enemies took advantage of the situation. Italy, having been humiliated at Adwa, continued to pursue its ambitions in East Africa. The Italians, recognizing the political instability within Ethiopia, sought to exploit the situation to their advantage. They had already established a colonial presence in Eritrea, and they were eager to expand their influence in the region. Italian diplomats worked tirelessly to build alliances with some of the more conservative factions within the Ethiopian court, offering economic incentives and promises of military support in exchange for political influence. The Italians saw an opportunity to regain their lost prestige and to secure their control over the Horn of Africa. Italy's renewed interest in Ethiopia came at a time when the country was deeply divided and politically weakened, and the Italians were keen to exploit these fractures. In addition to the Italian threat, Ethiopia's relationship with Britain and France also became increasingly complicated. Both of these European powers had interests in East Africa, and they had long been engaged in a complex rivalry for influence in the region. Britain, with its control of Sudan and strategic interests in the Red Sea, was keen to maintain its influence in Ethiopia. However, the growing power of Italy in the region, combined with Ethiopia's internal instability, made the situation increasingly precarious. France, too, had its own colonial interests in the Horn of Africa and was intent on maintaining its influence in the region. The French and the British, while not overtly hostile to Ethiopia, were nevertheless concerned about the growing presence of Italy in the region and sought to ensure that their own interests were protected. As foreign powers continued to jockey for influence in Ethiopia, the political situation in the country became even more unstable. The inability of the court to unite behind a single leader and the growing factionalism within the military and the aristocracy made it increasingly difficult for Ethiopia to maintain its sovereignty. While Iyasu continued to advocate for modernization and reform, his efforts were repeatedly thwarted by the entrenched interests of the nobility and the military. The political crisis deepened as Ethiopia's external enemies grew bolder in their efforts to secure a foothold in the country.